Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Warlord Games official podcast. My name is Brad. I am the host for this show, and this is the podcast that really digs into some of the new and exciting products that Warlord Games have put out. Now, if you've listened to this show at all, you will know that over time, you will have learned that I'm a massive bolt-action fan. It's how I found Warlord Games, and it is how I really got into the cool products they put out. Now, today we have on two authors of Bolt Action's newest book, and it's a really exciting new chapter for Bolt Action. Because, as you know, up until now, Bolt Action has always been the World War II game. Now, I hear people in the background calling out, in the Chinese, in the Empires in Flames book, Brad, it gets into the war in China, and that technically predates World War II. Well, some people do consider that as sort of either a preamble or the actual beginning of World War II itself. So we're still talking the same ballpark. Well, today we're actually going to get into a whole new era, a whole new battlefield, new armies, new rules, new everything. And sure, it's probably in the same time frame as what I was talking about with the Chinese conflict before World War II, except in the other direction. Of course, I'm talking about the war that followed up World War II, and I'm talking about the new book that's just come out, Korea. Now, to dig into that is a massive endeavor to take on an entire new conflict. And joining us today to talk about how they tackled that conflict, and I could go on about, what they've done and what they've written and where they've been, but with such a big book, we're just going to get right into it today. I would like to welcome Stephen Smith and John Russell to the Warlord Cast. Hey guys, welcome. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Hey, Brad.
Hey, it's good to be here, man. It's an exciting day for Bolt Action. There's just so much to talk about with this book. It's huge, first of all. Can one of you gentlemen please tell us how big this is?
It's the largest book that Warlord's done in the Bolt Action genre. It's 240 pages. It's larger than the Bolt Action 2 rulebook.
That's nuts, man. Now, I do want to clear up a misconception right off the bat, because I've posted a few posts about the Korea book through my own social media page. And one of the common misconceptions with this book is it's a brand new game. A lot of people believe that Bolt Action Korea is actually a game in and of itself. Can you tell us what it is exactly, and do they still need the Bolt Action 2 rulebook?
Okay, that's a great question, Brad. And here's the short answer. We clearly state in the opening pages that this is a supplement to Bolt Action 2.
Got it.
It is a standalone supplement that allows you to play a new genre of scenarios, but you absolutely must have the Bolt Action 2 rules to play Bolt Action Korea. Mm-hmm. It just gives a Bolt Action player an opportunity to take their late war armies, provided they're predominantly allied, and expand upon the figure range that they already have and play new scenarios that they haven't been able to play before. But because the Korean War came so short after the end of World War II, they can just bridge right over. So have to have the Bolt Action 2 base rule set to be able to use the Bolt Action Korea supplement.
And having said that, Brad, a lot of people out there, they'll say, well, then if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. In this case, it's a goose, because it's not quite Bolt Action.
Right.
And in the confines of your own home, if you want to fight a Bolt Action army against a Korea army, have a nut. However, in tournaments, they won't work. A Korean army will pretty much tear you up.
Oh, will it? Very nice.
Yeah, it's going to tear you up just because it's been 5 years, but the tactics and the weapons have improved immensely.
Nice.
And the organization of some of the units has certainly changed drastically, especially mid-war and late war. Don't want to get too far into the weeds on that, but some of the weapon systems have changed, and they were drastically improved.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the technology, even though it was kind of primitive, in accordance with today's technology, it was vastly different. The firepower levels were different. The coordination between the Air Force and the Army was vastly superior, especially with the Marines and the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
So, like John said, if you try to do a backwards compatible, it's not going to work. And the capabilities of a Korean Army list is going to far outweigh that of a late war Army list.
Got it. Let alone an early war one, right?
Yeah, but go ahead and try. I mean, if you want to go ahead and try it at your own home, but it won't work.
Right.
All right.
Well, let's get into this a little bit. I mean, you guys have thrown out a lot of talking points that I've already wanted to bring up. So first of all, bolt action, of course, there was we had the original Armies of series, which covered all the nations. They're typically called the Nation Army books. Of course, there's been the campaign books. We've had the theater books. There's been a whole new series of additions to the bolt action game, including Tank War. Now, this is, I believe, if Tank War didn't count as a supplement, is this the first proper supplement to bolt action?
I think when you put it in that context, Brad, probably, because it's got all of that.
Right. All right. Well, let's put a little bit of a preamble on this so people know what we're talking about. Because another thing that I've sort of discovered from posting a few things on social media is that some people are aware the Korean War exists. A lot of people have watched MASH. But given the scheme of, the scale of how well people, especially in bolt action land, know World War II, and given how much Vietnam's been talked about in popular culture, the Korean War is often talked about as the quote-unquote forgotten war. Now, for those who don't know, post-World War II, sort of the first 5 minutes of the Cold War, there was, technology was continuing to, as you say, advance militarily, because people are still spending a lot of money on making sure that their militaries are up to date. But by the same token, the Americans had, and largely a lot of the Allies, had mothballed a lot of their military. Technologically, they were still advancing, but they had, gotten rid of most of their forces. Basically everyone had stepped out of active service and had gone home. Now, of course, there were still military forces, but if we're thinking about the Allied military compared to what it was just, as you say, 5 years previously at the end of World War II, it's a massive difference, isn't it?
Yeah, it's green.
Exactly.
It was absolutely atrocious, and I put some of those statistics in the book. And this is why I went through and tried to outline a bit of a timeline to lead new players and new gamers who would be looking into this as to what's the background on the Korean War, because you used the term that I hear so often about the forgotten war. And one of the reasons why Korea is considered the forgotten war is because it's sandwiched between the greatest generation, World War II, and what you said, Vietnam. Vietnam generates so much more conversation and controversy, especially in the United States, than the Korean War ever did. And without getting into a longer conversation, the Korean War was the very first conflict that the United States was engaged in that ended in a truce.
Right. And,
we just had unconditional surrenders of the German nation and the Japanese Empire, and 5 years later we're doing a truce, and nobody knew what to do with that. So there was no big victory parade. There was no finality to the end of it.
Right.
And so even though the United Nations accomplished its mandate, it still felt hollow.
Right.
And so the American people didn't know what to do with that. And the American military was so focused on Europe and the Cold War that they just wanted Korea over with.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you this little bitty tidbit. You asked about nuances when we started. I'll tell you a little bitty tidbit. I've often said that the Korean War was a war that never should have happened. And it didn't have to happen, but the big three during the Yalta Conference discussed what to do about Korea specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And it was everybody agreed that Korea needed to be independent, but nobody agreed to what form of government Korea was going to have. Was it going to be an independent democratic nation? Was it going to be an independent communist nation? Was it going to be subjected to the United Nations? It was just like, yeah, well, Korea's going to be an independent country. And then they just left it blank.
Yeah.
And then 5 years later, there's a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So as weird as it sounds, the Korean War never really should have happened.
Well, and you know how it was divided. Well, Steve alludes to it in the book to kind of how it was divided. It just, two Americans were stuck in a Jeep, and they said, go divide this country because it's got to be divided and get ready for its independence.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't. So these two guys sat around for a while and then finally figured, well, I guess we're going to get this done, so let's just pick this. And they just agreed to make the line the 38th parallel. And that's how they divided Korea. And they said that the Russians will take care of the people up north until they're ready to go on their own, and the U.S. and the UN will take care of the South until they're ready to go on their own. But they never, like Steve said, discussed about what on their own would be.
Yeah. And funny that they chose those lines, or that line, I should say, given that how close one of them is to Seoul, the capital of the other. Yeah. And you just go, this was, I know there was a lot of political hoo-ha involved with that decision, but that line was literally decided upon, as you say, between two Americans, regular servicemen who were sort of this was hoisted on them, and they didn't even have a proper map. That line was decided by looking at a page from a National Geographic magazine.
Yes, very good, Brett.
Yeah.
And the Korean people were not consulted
At all.
No.
Yeah.
This thing was preordained. And now, looking back and looking at this historiographically, these people, the military, they had a mission to disarm the Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just trying to get their job done so they can go home.
Right.
And no fault of their own. They're just, following the simple orders that they had been given.
Mm-hmm.
But this never should have been left to these guys. This should have been a State Department and United Nations and
representatives from both countries.
And there was some guy in charge in Tokyo. What was his name?
Oh, I can't remember his name. Yeah.
It had 5 stars.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
What was it? That guy that was in charge.
Some emperor. Yeah.
Yeah, some emperor in Tokyo. He should have been in charge. Anyhow, please go ahead, Brad.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we're falling off into and I'm very, very much guilty of this, getting into a political discussion of how, that shook out. But
what did you say? Warning, rabbit hole ahead. No,
yeah, I feel like there's a couple. But again, without context, this war doesn't make complete sense. So can we quickly talk about maybe some of and I know this sort of goes into the missions in the book. So first of all, let's back up for a second. How many missions are in this 240-page book?
Well, there's 17 scenarios.
That's right.
But of those, 3 of them are what ifs, and we can get into those each because there's a reason why we did the what ifs.
Nice.
And a lot of people have asked us about it, and some of the complaints I've seen on the Facebook is that our scenarios are too specific. And the reason why we wrote them that way was we wanted to give you a feel of that time and that period and what was going on.
Right.
Now, me and Steve came down, was trying to figure out how else we could expand this book. And we stumbled upon the idea of period selectors because it's one theory. It's one theater. There's no theater selectors.
Right.
But there's a bunch of period selectors. So each army list has got 5 period selectors. And that's where you can really flesh out your armies and flesh out your experiences. Use the scenarios that we've written to get a feel for that. And we've also changed the map sizes on those scenarios. They're not your typical 4x6.
I did notice that.
Some of them are 4x2. Some of them, one's 3x10. So and that's one of my personal favorites. We'll talk about that one too. But
Well, I tell you what, Brad. Let me back up just a little bit and give you some idea of how this kind of came to be and how
Good.
it grew. Because John had this idea to do a Korea book, and when it first got started, the Warlord Studio said, "Okay, this is what we want. We want one book, one supplement, and we want the entire war in one supplement, and we want all major combatants, the 5 major combatants, and we want this from both perspectives."
Yeah.
And we want it in so many thousands of words. And I thought, no, but okay, we'll do that. And so I pecked away, and I remember I handed it off to John in the studio, and the studio's like, "But where's the
fluff?
Where's the fluff? And where's this? And where's that?" We kind of went back and forth with the studio, and and I was like arguing with my daughter. It was like, "But you said this many words, and that's what you got."
Mm-hmm.
And they kept saying, "Well, what about this?" And I said, "Well, you said this many words, and that's what you got."
Yep.
So finally they said, "Well, break down that barrier." Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
and it was like a tidal wave. And so it started to grow. And then the studio became more and more
excited about it,
excited and interested. And then it was,
they went down rabbit hole.
Oh man, did they go down rabbit hole?
So everybody wanted to include their rabbit hole. So it became,
yeah.
When we finally finished this about probably 6 months before it was printed, we had to say, we had to call knock it off. We had to stop because it still would have been written by now because there were so many things.
Right. And so as we progressed along and I'm doing all this research, I could have written many books, miniature books on the Commonwealth or China or even North Korea. But the overall intent was to put together competitive army list for the Korean War, not necessarily for tournaments per se.
Right.
And as John said, we came up with this idea for period selectors because the war evolved naturally over a scale of time.
Yeah.
And so the Chinese intervention and the collapse of the Chinese in the spring and the early summer of 51 allowed for these period selectors and the different arrival times of the Allied contingents. And oh man, there's some of them are really cool.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, the Ethiopians.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that the scenarios in this book, and I'm going to let John talk the scenario piece because he was really the king of the hill of that. The scenarios in this book are designed not only to play, but to also teach a bit of history about the Korean War, because as you alluded to, so many of our players, bolt action players, already know so much about World War II,
right?
And they know so little about the Korean War. And there were great battles that took place in Korea that haven't been given their proper due for the men on both sides who fought these engagements. So the scenarios are not necessarily designed just to entertain. They're also designed in a small way to teach.
Yeah, to educate.
Educate, yep. Steve has written, I bet we've had a lot of questions about the book. A lot of people ask us questions, and it's becoming obvious sometimes that they haven't read all the book yet because they jump to the army list or they jump to the scenario. And Steve is, if you go through that book, Brad, I think Steve's put a history lesson in every single entry, every single paragraph. Learn something. And it's just, I understand it's a large task, but you'll come out of the other end of this if you read this book a little more educated.
Oh yeah, a little bit. How about a lot more? Having flipped through the book, I've gone, woo. Yeah, there's quite a lot in there.
Well, we tried to, like Steve said, we had a mandate to write it from both sides. So we tried to stay neutral the whole way through. We tried to present Chinese heroes or notable combatants. We tried to present the Chinese perspective, the North Korean perspective, heroes and notable combatants from both sides. So, and there's always, this isn't the end all be all written in concrete. Me and Steve have introduced Korea now. So if there's something that out there that your listeners are very passionate about, and they've got the research, I mean, you can check our bibliography. We've done our homework. But if you've got something that's burning a hole in your history pocket, and you really want to get it out there, write a PDF and send it to Warlord, and who knows? You saw all those scenarios that we did for the D-Day campaign. There's nothing saying that we can't do the same thing for Korea.
Totally. Yeah, no, absolutely right. And I think a conflict like this, and as you say, your book sort of opens the door, and there really are, I mean, countless rabbit holes, as you've also said, to sort of to go down with this conflict. I mean, I'm holding the Osprey Korean War. They do those softback books, and it's 96 pages of just bare bones outlining of battles. And the conflict as a whole, and it barely scratches the surface. How you guys were able to cram new army lists, new units, scenarios to match a lot of those conflicts, and have all of that line up and add history in 240 pages is astonishing.
A lot of sweat, blood, and tears.
I hear you, man. I hear you. Well, okay. I do want to get to the missions, and we are going to come back to that in a sec. But I hear the internet calling, and people want to know the army list. I mean, one of the common threads with bolt action books is, Brad, ask the guests, what's in the book? How can I add this to my existing bolt action army? Now, we've already said that you really can't do that. So what are the army lists that people can build from scratch then? I know we have the Americans, so where do we go from there?
Well, you can take your later war Americans, your late war French, your late war British, and they'll transfer over pretty much. Australians, yeah, the Australians will be there too.
Aussies,
yeah. They'll work, and but for a completely brand new army, we've got the Koreans and we've got the Chinese, and I got to tell you, those Chinese, oh my goodness, that was Steve sat. It was 5 or 6 months trying to crack that list. And then thank goodness for George Nafziger and his collection of books. He had 2 books that really kind of cracked the code for us. And we were able to get into, it was after action reports, interrogation of prisoners, and SLA marshals. And a lot of people, when they study Korea, they go 2 ways. They either love Slam, they call them, or they hate him, SLA marshal. But because of what he did in the interviews, the United States Army changed forever from that day on. But the 2 newest armies now to the bolt action family, I guess you could say, are the Chinese and the North Koreans. Oh, and the South Koreans.
I was going to say, and the South Koreans, yeah.
Yeah, correct. There's 3.
Well, and let me say this, that, players need to understand a realism of business. That, we build an army list, but that army list is transplanted to a business in the UK, and that business has to model those figures, and then they've got to package those figures, and they've got so much space that they can put in a shipping container,
right?
And then you've got to send them all over the world. So we tried to meld together as accurate an army list as possible for an infantry squad that's going to be able to fit accurately and comfortably inside of a box or a blister package that's going to be able to go into a shipping container and then go halfway around the world to Australia.
Right.
So, there has to be a little bit of give and take sometimes. And that might not necessarily apply, say, to an infantry squad, but it certainly may apply to a mortar team or an artillery battery section. So there were a couple of times that, just with the Chinese, that I had to trim back the size of the artillery the crews, because the Chinese had huge crews for their artillery.
They did,
because too much of it was man packed. But I had a conversation via email with Paul, Mr. Paul Sawyer, and he asked a very simple question. He's like, "What are these figures actually going to do on the tabletop?" I thought, well, nothing really. They're going to occupy space, and they're going to look cool, and they're going to be more figures for some poor guy to buy and paint. In my mind, I'm thinking it'll look more accurate.
Yeah.
But from the business standpoint, from a gamer standpoint, all it's going to do is clutter up the table, and that gamer's going to be like, I'm not painting these guys because they're not going to do anything.
Right.
So the agreement was, well, we're going to have to reduce the size of these artillery crews.
Yeah, and keep it in line with the bolt action that we know already.
Yes.
Yep.
And I really want to make that point that it was, a lot of this was kept in line, as you said, to use your phrase, compatible and comparable with a game that everybody already knows. And so there's not a whole lot of deviation in many respects. I mean, you might see a deviation in the Chinese or the North Koreans for a submachine gun company, because that's what they had. That was something akin to the Russians too.
Exactly.
So you got some different formations, but in many respects, a lot of the formations may look similar to something that came out of World War II. But we had to adjust the sizes to make them more game friendly.
Yeah,
tabletop friendly.
Tabletop friendly.
Yeah. So, but everything was researched down to the nth degree, and then double checked and double crossed. And when I say double crossed, I mean if I had it in one document, I made sure I found that in another document. Yeah. So
that was a painstaking part.
Yes.
Especially for the Chinese. There was not a lot out there, Brad, when we first started this, and it was painful.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. I do want to say this about the Chinese Army and what led to the Chinese Army list, that, when they say that the Chinese people volunteer army, it really was. They were volunteers. They were not paid when they fought in Korea. They took soldiers out of military formations, and they made units out of them, and they sent them across the Yalu River. There was not an MTONE for these units.
Oh.
So, no.
Military table of organization for the non-military people.
It did not exist.
Oh, that's crazy.
So what I used for the base foundation and grew upon was a declassified 9th Army military intelligence document from it was sometime February of 1951 that I obtained that through prisoner of war interrogation.
Oh man. Oh, all for a game book.
It was, like I said, the bibliography is one page, and then the movies and TV shows is half a page. So that, and that's not all of it. That's not all of it.
The research was months and months and months. But yes, I mean, that just gives you an idea of just one source that was used for the Chinese. And then, to sit and read through this ancient PDF of declassified, almost 70-year-old military jargon thing. I mean, it's a good thing that I'm a military vet, because I was able to read through it. But the typos, oh man,
the typos, and then also, we would run across. There was a story that we ran across that we could not substantiate, so we did not include in the book.
Right.
But it was nice to talk to some veterans, and one guy talked about his uncle or his grandfather during one of these attacks by the Chinese, and the horsemen were riding up, and they were shooting mortars from their back of the horses.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, exactly. Man. Exactly. Now, maybe they were the Japanese trench, the knee mortar, that, maybe
the 2-inch
2-inch mortar. We don't know, but we couldn't substantiate that. So instead of, throw it in there because it sounds cool and looks cool, can you imagine the model? Yeah. Now, most of the sources, I think I can speak this, that the units that are in the book have been researched and found 2 or 3 examples of. Right. It's not like we thought, oh, this would be cool. I mean, the Chinese have 2 different cavalries. The cavalry list is always important. You know, I helped with lesson on the cavalry rules, so I try to. They're near and dear to my heart. But the Chinese have 2 cavalry rules. They have cavalry, and they have Mongolian Calvary.
Oh,
Mongol. Yeah, they're in there for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't just cross with some cavalry; they crossed with cavalry divisions.
Oh.
Yeah.
Mongolian. I mean, the Golden Horde rode again.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into this, because I hear bolt action players saying you're giving us the info. Now you're giving us tons of background, but how does that translate to the tabletop? So let's start with the Chinese. With the Chinese list, what sort of national rules have you given these guys to sort of reflect that sort of open span without formal organization? What national rules do you use to sort of put that army on the tabletop?
All right, Brad, I'm going to answer that question, but I got to preface it first.
Of course. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, but this applies to all the major combatant army lists.
Okay.
And I've got this massive file at home.
Mm-hmm.
When I started to build each of the armies,
Mm-hmm.
I based each army, the architecture, the framework off of each army list off of an existing bolt action army list already available. Okay.
So everything, I mean, so there'll be a lot of familiar rules, but again, everything adapts to the new conflict.
Yes.
Yes. So the first one that comes to my mind is the North Koreans. You know, I used like a 1944 Soviet list when I first started building the reinforced platoon. And so I started that as my base document. And then from there, I built the period selectors, and then I went in and I looked at the national rules and, of course, talked to John about all this stuff. So your players are going to see a lot of similarities. It wasn't that we just copied and pasted or slash. No, we looked at what applied. And so for the Chinese, a lot of the Empire of the Sun stuff kind of applied to the Chinese for both the communist and the nationalist forces, because by 1950, the Communist Party had almost won over the entire country.
Right.
But all of those nationalist forces were still
duking it out.
Absolutely.
So we blended a lot of those forces, and that reflects. So
yeah, and just because you picked the Chinese, I want to point out there's 4 special rules for them, but they've also got other little enhancers. For example, on page 165, there's a box out for bugles, and unfortunately, the last 2 sentences were cut out, and it should have it talks about in any of the after action reports. They talked a lot about bugles, noisemakers, cymbals, drums, flutes, and they didn't know what the heck was going on. So there's 2 sentences, and I sent it over to you. The 2 sentences that are missing is, in scenarios set before June 1951, you can represent this by giving a -1 morale penalty to any infantry or artillery unit that's within 18 inches of a Chinese model that's carrying a musical instrument. And in the Chinese army, there is a guy with a bugle. So if any of your allies are within 18 inches of this guy, you have a -1 morale penalty to anything you roll. Now, after June 1951, they figured it out and it was ignored. But that's just the way we start out the Chinese army list.
That's cool. Yeah, it gives it it gives it that historical flavor, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then we've got 4 special rules. We've got conscript levy. We've got sparrow tactics, flag, and short attack. And again, some of those folks say, well, you just cut and paste. Well, no, we based it upon another entry from before, but it's been modified and brought up to 1950.
Right. Well, it's consistent, right? For those who don't know, I'm a Chinese player in bolt action. It's one of the armies I play predominantly.
Well, let me tell you, Brett, make sure, just because you see the phrase conscript levy,
Mm-hmm.
don't assume that every word is the same.
No, it's not, is it? It's different.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's been modified for the Korean War.
Yeah. Well, I love how you guys have taken existing national rules and modified it, as I say, to match across, because it gives that familiarity. It's not like all of a sudden we're talking 5 years after the end of World War II, and those Chinese lists were designed to be all inclusive as it is, because the Chinese, that army list is meant to represent forces for literally 15 years, if not longer, of the conflict. And now to modify them and put them into Korea means that you can represent forces up to 20 years. And yes, gives it a very broad scope. But again, a lot of the Chinese, the way that list was written and the way it carries through to the Korean book is, as you say, there are other the units that you pick and the special rules that they give you really does then give it that flavor. So I really like what you've done there with you guys, as far as using the national rules and then bringing them forward, especially since you're not just, as you say, cutting and pasting, you're adapting them to make them fit. So let's talk about some of those units then within the Chinese list. How are you giving them that flavor?
Well, with the short attack and the sparrow tactics, the guerrillas and the night infiltrators and the guerrilla cells and the partisan cells are going to get in your face real fast.
Oh yeah.
And then if you are strictly just infantry with the short attack, the Chinese officer, kind of like what the Germans do, they get an extra dice if they do a snap too.
Oh,
so
nice.
You're moving your infantry a lot faster. And one of the infantry squads that we went round and around and around with, but me and Steve fought for it because they were in the battle. But there's an old story about Jervis Johnson. When you're a game designer, you're asking people to kill their babies.
Right.
And I'll preface this. What we were asking to do was me and Steve were asking Alessio and Paul to break bolt action with this unit I'm going to talk about. And they refused at first. And we said, but look, documentation after documentation, these guys were out there. We got to have them in there. And they were saying no. So they were asking us to kill our baby because we really, really fought for this. And we had a compromise. And the unit we're talking about is the Chinese Grenadiers. Brad, these guys were a unit of 4 or 5 guys. All they had were bags and bags of grenades. And they'd run up and they'd throw grenades at the UN forces to get their heads down. So when the submachine gun units came up behind them, they could just spray the trenches. Now,
crazy.
The Americans at first were a little worried about these grenades, but then they discovered that 1 out of 4 were duds, and the ones that did go off sometimes weren't properly charged or had enough gunpowder, so they became contemptuous. Some of them still got killed, don't get me wrong, but they didn't become the big thing that they thought they were. But we had to have grenadiers in the Chinese. So we went back and forth up until probably the last couple of months before the editing, and we finally had a compromise. There are grenadiers in the Chinese army list, and they only have grenades. But those grenades, so it doesn't break the bolt action game, act like pistols. So when they get within 6 inches, it's like they all have pistols and they shoot a crap load of pistols. And then they get them to get their heads down, and here comes the SMG squads to spray more. So that's a brand new, never seen before in bolt action is the grenadier.
I was going to say, that's never been in bolt action before. An all pistol squad like that. That's awesome.
All grenade squad, but yeah, exactly. So that's a new unit. The Mongolian Calvary is a new unit. They had 2 different types of cavalry. Like Steve said, the Mongol Horde rides again. The Golden Horde rides again. They have Born in the Saddle, which means they can shoot their rifles from the back of the horse. They're not carbines, they're rifles.
Oh, cool.
So those are in there. We've got some machine gun squads, cavalry squads, engineer squads, guerrilla cells, scout teams, night infiltrators, light machine guns, medium machine guns, heavies. There are some things, before. Flamethrowers. We have bazooka teams. The bazooka played a prominent role. A lot of it was captured because the Americans discovered that the 2.36 was a piece of junk, and they throw them down. And then they got the 3-inch, and they became super bazookas.
Well, and let me say that a lot of Chinese players are going to sit back and go, oh, well, I've got more infantry squads than I was ever allowed to have in bolt action. Yes, this is true. But you're not going to have a lot of artillery. You're not going to have any aircraft. You're not going to have
any aircraft guns,
any anti-aircraft guns to speak of. You're not going to have armor to speak of. You're just going to have truckloads of infantry.
Right.
That's what the Chinese had. And so one of the ways that I was able to duplicate that the myth of the Chinese horde was to give the Chinese all these extra units, the night infiltrators and the guerrillas. And a lot of people became very upset when they started seeing the guerrilla cells, but they don't realize that, there were tens of thousands of guerrillas operating all up and down Korea on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got plenty of documentation. I'd be happy to send to you about that stuff.
And those you're gonna see those reflected into Cruel Seas scenarios, maybe some firefight scenarios, just some one-off stuff. But some people they look at us, they go, well, look, I'm looking at that Chinese army list, and with my constricted levy, and then my sparrow tactics, I'm halfway across the board, and then you're going to give a short attack, allows them to move even more infantry. They're halfway across the board that's not fair. Well, guess what? This is Korea, and that's what it is, and war isn't fair. Yeah. And who said that we had to have a balanced scenario? When you start going down the rabbit holes and you do your research of the Korea, you're going to discover that they didn't just. This isn't a black powder. Let's line up and shoot our guns and march.
Right.
Well, and I want to say this about it's not fair. Okay, well, go to the back of the book and take a look at the big stack of special rules.
Yeah.
And you start adding in a big stack of the special rules into your scenario, and then play the game.
Yeah.
And test yourself. Bolt Action Korea is all about testing yourself as a gamer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Don't fall. And you touched on it earlier. Just because it looks like city fight, or looks like raiding, or looks like mud in front, you got to read the rules because it's not the same. We took that because we knew bolt action players used to minefields or used to weather or fog, but Korea has all of that. 70% of it's mountain, so they've got all stuff. So just because it says city fight doesn't mean it's city fight, because there's sewer moving in there and a bunch of other fun things.
Yeah, that's cool. Again, these are the rules that really do make the conflict unique and original, and different than what we're used to. Especially, I get the feeling that I hear you mention that a few people have talked about some of the things that they've seen in the book and maybe been a tad critical. I think that when you are talking about playing this in sort of a narrative sense, when you are talking about playing it with your friends, when you're talking about even having Korean events where you have Korean style armies facing off using these missions, again, it's a different feel. It looks like the bolt action game that we know and love. It smells like the bolt action game that we know and love. You can go through all the senses there, but it's different, and it should be approached as different.
Yeah, it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, but it's a goose. It's a goose.
Yeah, exactly. And so you should give it its due in that it is a different way of playing. It's a different game, but it's the same, if that makes sense.
Well, and there's so many things that me and Steve caught, and there's a few things that slipped through. Now, me and Steve spent about a year and a half on this book. I've been talking about it for 3 years, and we worked pretty hard for a year and a half. And on all that year and a half time, Brad, me and Steve never thought about the night weapons, and they put one on the cover. So,
oops.
So for right now, and then of course, on page 220, there's another picture of a guy with one. So to caveat, and there'll be a PDF maybe later, if you want to play with those guys, use the German night fighting rules with their night weapons, because that's what it'll be. It'll be modified, but. Yeah. Again, we tried to cover so many things in this book, and stuff can slip through.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, we've talked a little bit about the Chinese. Let's talk about, if we're talking about looks the same, smells the same, very similar army list. Let's talk about the giant one, the U.S.
The
Americans. Now, I have a giant gray coat American, winter clothed, existing Battle of the Bulge army painted, ready to go. Now, I'm eyeing up the Patton tank, something fierce to add to that. And if I'm reading this book right, that's all I really need. I mean, I don't even need the Patton. I can use some of my existing tanks, but I want to put that extra flavor in there to really make my force pop for Korea. Talk to us a little bit about how the Americans in particular poured over.
Okay. So you've got Battle of the Bulge, U.S., and you said it's an infantry force?
It's a big generalist force. I have a ton of transports, a bunch of half tracks, a bunch of trucks, some tanks. Okay. I mean, that kind of late war force will work well for this. I mean, there's still
what you can add to yours, Brad, besides the Patton, is the Katusas. Add the Katusas.
Nice.
And helicopters. And we'll talk about helicopters because that's the big one. But the Katusa allowed a Katusa is a Korean augmentation to the U.S. Army. Katusa, K-A-T-U-S-A. And what they were Korean infantrymen that weren't really knowledgeable in the warfare, so they were attached to an American unit. So you can beef up your American units by up to 3 Katusas. Now, if you do that, however, you got a little language barrier in there, so you start the game off with a pin because you're trying to, but you'll beef up your squads. And of course, the linchpin for your army is you're going to want to look at on page one of a lot of veterans, and we were talking to a major general out in California this weekend. Yeah, Major General John Harrell, thank you very much. Page 118, the seasoned NCO. The seasoned NCO is, me and Steve modeled him after the Sam Elliott character from We Were Soldiers. He's that grizzly old veteran that nobody crossed his path. And what he'll do for a measly 50 points, what he'll do is if he's within 6 inches of an officer, not a major, but if he's in 6 inches of a first lieutenant, second lieutenant, or captain, he makes him one better. So now your first lieutenant's a captain. Now your second lieutenant's a lieutenant. And they act just like a captain as long as he's within 6 inches. And if the unfortunate thing happens and that sniper just happens to take out that officer, your seasoned NCO now becomes a first lieutenant.
Oh, that's cool. That is very cool.
With all the bells and whistles. Your medic now saves on a 5 or 6 because of the forward deployed mobile army surgical hospitals and the ability to go pick up wounded. Now your medics save on a 5 or 6. And if you have an air observer, and this is where it really gets to be fun, you'll see both the United States and the United Kingdom have helicopters.
Oh, I was going to throw out the napalm.
Well, there is napalm too. We'll talk about napalm. Yeah, but helicopters. Okay. Now, some people have.
Hold on, Brad. Are you having a moment yet?
Oh, I'm loving this. Keep going. Don't stop. This is beautiful.
Okay. Well, there's love-hate relationship with helicopters. Now, there was no. Well, I can't say there was no. There was 2 amphibious, is what they called them at the time, assaults by helicopters. They were on undefended, unguarded hilltops. They dropped some Marines in a fire base. Sound familiar? And they had a fire team there, but it was unopposed. The real backbone workhorse of the helicopters were in 3 different roles. It was either reconnaissance, aerial observation, or medevac. Now, some people say if I'm if I'm going to pay the points, I should get it automatically. Well, we just didn't have that many helicopters running around. Okay. Right. So, for example, reconnaissance. You got to have an air observer first of all, and then you pay 30 points for 2 uses. Okay, you only get it twice. And then when you want to call it in, you have to roll the dice, and a 5 or a 6 it kicks off. So it's tricky to get it.
Right.
But what that reconnaissance does is on a 4 or better, on every hidden unit on the board, they become seen.
Oh, cool.
Now, here's the next one. Aerial observer, 40 points. Okay, again, 5 or 6, it works. What the air observer now does, for the duration of that turn, all spotters for all artillery units see everything.
Oof. Oof. Yeah, you can definitely do some hurt with that then, can't you?
And then the final one is the medvac. It's the cheapest. It's only 20 points. Mm-hmm. You can use it twice. And on a 4 or better, that means the Sioux helicopters are coming in and they're getting your wounded out. And it expands that 6 inches of your medic to 18 inches.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that definitely helps.
So, again, now you can see why, if you can try it in the confines of your home, but a World War II American or British Korean army is not going to, a World War II army won't stand up if you start using helicopters.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, like Steve said, you go back to, if you call it in and you start to run, and you call it in, and the aircraft come in, now you're going to have either pistons. This is back on page 215. You're either going to have pistons, the jet or propeller driven on a 4, 5, or 6, or 1, 2, 3, the jets come in. Now, jets come in, they're harder to hit. You have to roll a 6 to hit them with your own aircraft, and they're a little bit fragile. With a 4 hits, they'll abort. Whereas pistons, you can hit them on a 5 or 6, but they hang around and they won't abort until 6 hits. Oof. But the magic is if you roll a 5 or 6, and that's the napalm.
Yeah, I'm having flashes of apocalypse now. Okay, yep, continue.
Yeah, the target takes D3 plus 2 pins. And it's a 4-inch template, all right? And it does a 3-inch penetration, plus 3 penetration. And then from that point of impact, you roll 2d6, and in a straight line, it goes across the board that distance because it spreads.
Oh.
And now everything will be hit with a 5-pin, D3 plus 2 pins, and you can't go down to have hits.
That's nuts, yeah.
Brad, you know that Chinese horde that was halfway across the board?
Yep. Yeah, that will take care of that.
Exactly. So,
hey, you were talking about you had this big, United States Army force, and if you want to bring in a patent, from about the time of, say, September, October 1950 on, your force would be viable, because that's about the time some of the patent tanks started rolling in, at least by October. So you'd be restricted on when you could use that force. But I want to throw this out at you too. Another high-hanging curveball, to use an Americanism. I'm referring to a baseball term there.
Oh, people.
Yeah. You could take that American force, since they're wearing winter gear and the Americans outfitted so many of the allies. You can play the Belgians. You can play the Ethiopians, the Turks, the Greeks, the Dutch,
Colombians,
Filipinos.
I mean,
yeah. So you can take that American force and decide, for this game, I'm gonna play them as the Greeks.
That's cool.
And there's rules in there for that. And we've talked with the studio, and we're still kicking around the idea that when these 13 other nations came into Korea, they were given American or British kit. So instead of making a whole Greek figure or a whole Turk, we're going to maybe have heads. So you just heads on these guys. So now, because and I know that the late war Americans didn't have spats in Korea like the model does, but I mean, okay, we'll count that button and buff that Persian blue.
Right.
But I mean, to get figures on the table, this is what we did.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, as you say, sometimes you got to make a little bit of a sacrifice, uniform wise, just to get what you want on the table. And man, there's so many options. Just talking through some of and I'm glad you brought up the sort of those minor nations that used American kit, and just the viability of using existing American forces, using those, rules just blows open the door. It's like using the Free French in the Battle of the Bulge book, for example, using American rules. It's a new way to play Americans. Well, now you have tons of different ways to play Americans, which is really exciting.
Well, and we tied a bunch of it to historical too. A lot of people were busting our chops. Why do we have Rangers and Raiders? There's Rangers and there's Raiders. Well, you look at them, they're pretty much the same. One costs more than the other, but why not just get rid of the Raiders and just use Rangers? Well, it's because the United States Army disbanded all Ranger units in 1950. And all the commanders said, no, we want those guys.
Yeah.
So they made their own units inside their own divisions, their own battalions, their own companies.
Mm-hmm.
And they picked some of these guys that were rangers and made them raiders.
Got it.
So that's why there's two annotations in the book on page 122 of rangers and raiders. Yeah, they look the same, but they're not. That's
Exactly.
that goose again.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Again, similar but different.
Yeah, and you go to the period selector, and you see where you can and can't have them.
Right.
The period selector is the thing that really makes this click.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us about that, because this isn't just a simple matter of early war, mid-war, and late war. As you say, it differentiates further than that.
Yeah, there's 5 different period selectors for everybody. Mm-hmm. All right. The first one is defense of Pusan, and then advance across the 38. Oh, wait a minute. There's even one before that.
There's the invasion.
Yeah, there's the invasion one.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's defense. Then there's advance. Then there's Chinese intervention. And then there's July 51 and July 52. There's, and some of them are different than other ones. Like for the Chinese, they have 51 to 53. So there's not only is there period selectors, but there's period selectors to army lists.
Right.
So the Chinese period selector is going to be different from the Korean army list. So it's not a cookie cutter.
Right.
They're designed specifically for that army and this period selector. I can't say there's just 5. There's different ones for each army.
Oh, that's awesome. It differentiates out in a big way. But if you wanted to play, if you and your friends wanted to get together and play like a Korean themed game, and there was like 3 or 4 of you and you wanted to have a couple of tables and play a couple different games, you could all, for example, agree on a similar year, and you could cross-reference that to the selector not the selector. I'm so used to bolt action terminology, but essentially the selector or the period selector for that time frame, and you can play historically themed games.
Yes, absolutely. Because depending on the different nationality that you and your friends decide to sit down and play, if one of them was wanting to play the Ethiopian Battalions, the Ethiopians showed up at a specific time.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as whatever the time period was, I think it was like the summer of 51. As long as it was after the summer of 51, then everybody's good to go.
Nice.
So,
the Cagnu Battalion.
The Cagnu Battalion.
197 caveat. Never. At the end of the war, there was a prisoner exchange, and all the prisoners have been taken. Mostly, I should say, some were still held. At least that's what some of the speculation is. There was no Ethiopians exchanged because there was no Ethiopians captured, and in every battle the Ethiopians participated in, they won.
Oh, that's crazy.
So there's that in the back of the book as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, okay, we've talked about the Chinese, we've talked about the Americans. Let's talk about maybe another force that people might be familiar with, army-wise, and let's talk about the Commonwealth. Now, I know you've mentioned Australians. I know you've mentioned Commonwealth in general. Talk to us about that in general.
Well, the first unit that transferred in was the Hong Kong regiment, because they were so close, and that comprised of 3 infantry battalions. The United Kingdom already had a lot going on in Malaysia, and the United Kingdom was supportive, but not real enthused about the entire situation. But as a show of solidarity, they went ahead and sent in these 3 infantry regiments, and it was just 3 infantry regiments. And then I think it was by, October, November, other units started to arrive, and one of the more famous units was the 41 Commando. Those lads were, I could talk about them for the next 30 minutes, so I won't.
Right.
That's a fun bunch.
And we'll use some. We'll be doing some Cruel Sea stuff for those guys.
Yeah.
Nice.
So they're a fun bunch. But again, they received all-American kit by the time that they arrived, and that was all for logistical reasons, just to be able to maintain resupply. A lot of these units received American kit. So when players are looking through some of the Commonwealth stuff and they see units equipped with American stuff, that's not a typo. That was for logistics reasons.
Right.
It's still a little bit of your UK feel with the bombardment and artillery support and national character, but then they have access to helicopters and they have access to the seasoned NCO, even more so than the American, and their medics were like ours.
Yes. And then once the Hong Kong regiment showed up, then the 3rd Royal Australian Regiment, the 3rd Battalion Royal Australians, the 16th New Zealand Artillery, and the 2nd Princess Patricia Light Infantry all bonded together to form another brigade. Mm-hmm. And later on, they would go on to form the 1st Commonwealth Division, which was a really unique fighting force. A really fabulous job. All their engagements, and they fought us tremendous battles. Of course,
River, yeah.
The Battle of the Imjin River and the stand of the Glorious Gloucesters, and a battle that I love researching is the one that the Commonwealth Brigade fought in the Battle of Kapyong during the 5th Chinese Offensive. It happened at the same time period as the stand of the Glorious Gloucesters, but is at the other end of the river. Mm-hmm. And if the Gloucesters and the other Commonwealth Brigade hadn't made their stand along the Imjin, then the UN line probably would have broke again, and Seoul would have been captured for the 3rd time. So the Commonwealth troops fought very hard. Nice. A little caveat in history: a lot of people don't know that Sir Michael Caine was a Fusilier during the Korean War.
Yep.
And
Did not know that.
He was medically retired for
wounds acquired.
No, he developed. I keep wanting to say like trench fever, but he developed some type of infectious situation and was medevaced home.
And just as a caveat, you'd asked us about behind the scenes kind of stuff. On page 158, there's a neat little story about the Centurions made their debut.
Yes.
In Korea. And just to show you how much the Korea had infiltrated, the Korea bug had infiltrated into the Warlord Games hierarchy. Mm-hmm. John Stollard put me and Steve on a storyline and even had a video movie kind of thing about a standoff between some Centurions and an interesting other encounter of enemy. I don't want to spoil it. I'll let people read it, but on page 158, it's called One of Their Own, and it's an interesting story. But John Stollard turned us on, so even he got the bug for Korea.
That's
he gave us that place. So we had to put it in.
Nice. Okay, well, what rules is it again where we see similar rules from the Commonwealth that we're used to that have been modified? Are there differentiations for the different Commonwealth countries? What are we talking here?
Well, again, there's that British and Commonwealth special rules of, the national characteristic that's still in there.
Yep.
The artillery sport's still kind of in there. But then, the Canadians and the Australians are they're a little different. They got, and then everybody's got access to helicopters.
Awesome.
So they're like we go back to, it's a goose. They're there. They look like a duck, but they're a goose.
They're a very different animal. All right. Well, we've kind of talked. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to make the point that, unlike maybe in a game of bolt action, you would see in a game of bolt action Korea, I should say in a game of bolt action 2, what you would see in a game of bolt action Korea that would not be unusual on the tabletop. In your force, you might have your infantry platoon might be Australian. Your artillery section might be from New Zealand. Oh. And you might have a support section that would be Canadian. And, you might have an armored section that's American.
Right.
So the first rule on Korean War Special Rules on page 213 is multinational forces.
Yeah. So that will not be unusual in bolt action Korea.
That's cool. I mean, that again gives you a different way to. I mean, you can almost combine existing armies in some cases. You can take existing units from other armies you may have and add them sort of together, add a couple new things, and you have a brand spanking new Korean army.
Welcome to Korea, Brad.
Awesome.
Bingo.
Love it. I love that. I love when you get to use existing armies in new and interesting ways. It gives them that it revitalizes them. It gives them that whole new life on the tabletop.
Yep. And then you throw in notable combatants.
Yes.
We wanted to put, there's special kind of characters that we discovered on our journey that really kind of set us off, and we wanted to get them in there somewhere. But we didn't want to call them heroes because everybody has heroes. So we call them notable combatants.
Nice.
Now, the communist forces didn't have that cult personality like the UN forces did.
Right.
So we could have, again, gone all day, but we limited it to 3. But there's no reason why we can't find your own. But we limited it to 3 for each side. And there's 3 communist heroes that are amalgamation of several persons or events, or tanks, for this instance, tank 215, which is in the Beijing Museum. So we had to do that guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Commander Tupac of Tank 215. You're going to pay 325 points for this guy.
Ooh. Hopefully he comes with a tank.
He comes with a T-34-85, and he has Eye of Terrain, Bulldozer, Hair Trigger, and Lucky.
Awesome.
And they can rapid fire. Did I mention that too?
Oh, that is awesome.
So we've got 3 combatants for the Chinese, and we have 3 combatants for the UN. And the one that kind of started this whole story for me 3 years ago was Sergeant Reckless. A lot of people don't know about her. I didn't slur it, her. And she's a horse, but she's the only animal that I know of in the history of the United States military that actually held a rank, retired, and her stipend went to her care and feeding until the day she died. She held the rank of staff sergeant. She was given that rank by one of the commandants. Later on, became the commandant of the Marine Corps, and she's buried at Pendleton. And there's a book about her. But she's pretty brave. She was a little Korean racehorse that the Marines bought off of this boy for $250, and they used her to carry 75 millimeter recoilless rifle rounds up and down the trails. And during a particularly horrific battle in 52 or 53, October 52 is the big one. She carried 386 recoilless rifle rounds up and down these hills. And when I say up and down these hills, she was shown the route once, and then she'd do it on her own. Nobody let her. And she'd come up and down. That's about 9,000 pounds.
That's unbelievable.
And she was also escorted troops back down off the hill and took 2 wounds, and actually has got 2 Purple Hearts. So she's a medic and a transport.
That's crazy.
And then you got William Speakman, a 6'6" Britishman that was throwing grenades and beer bottles at the Chinese. He's another guy that's just incredible. And he was the first guy to get a Victoria Cross. Well, he was awarded it by King George, but he received it from Queen Elizabeth, and it was her first Victoria Cross she gave out. And he was with us until just last year, July 2018, when he died.
That is absolutely crazy. Yeah, I mean, when you start talking about some of the personalities in these lists, it's pretty crazy, right? I mean, again, it's a whole new catalog of people outside of the realm of what we'd normally know in the land of bolt action that you can include on these tabletops, whose stories sound crazy and outlandish only because we're not familiar with the conflicts.
Exactly. And some of the people are busting our chops about, we'll jump back briefly to the American M4s because they have easily light. And the reason we understand that could be, it is and it isn't a legend, but the reason why Steve put that in there is because some of those M4s 3 months ago were on a plinth, were in storage, wrapped in cosmoline, were stuffed in stuff. We were grabbing everything that wasn't tied down to throw into this conflict. Right. So it's not that they would easily catch fire. It's that the guy didn't hook up that hose to get the hydraulics to work right, or it was rotted. It has been sitting out on a pole on some guy's park for a while.
Yeah, exactly.
This the truth. When the first tanks that went to Korea was 4 tanks,
Mm-hmm.
and they were cannibalized in the Tokyo maintenance depot, and they weren't even the same 4 tanks.
That's crazy.
It lasted, I think, 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other tanks, as John was saying, almost every other tank was sitting in front of like a VFW
Mm-hmm.
or in front of a museum somewhere, or they were rusting away at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, and they were cobbled together.
Mm-hmm.
The only formation that took tanks to war that were ready to go to war was the 6th, I think it was the 6th Tank Battalion of the Marine Corps. And if I've got that wrong, I apologize, but it was the Marine Corps. They were the only ones that were combat ready. The United States Army had done away with its tank battalion
Mm-hmm.
in the United States and in the Far East. And so what these guys were rolling into action with right off the bat
We're ready.
were not ready. And, you know, I've got plenty of literature that I can provide.
Mm.
So it's really stunning to think that a nation that, you know, had done what it had done in 1945, how woefully unprepared we were in 1950.
Right.
And without creating another political conversation, you know, President Truman just simply said, send in the soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
There never was a declaration of war or an act by Congress. He did that unilaterally.
Yeah.
And that same policy has been followed ever since.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And speaking of Truman, we'll give you a little background on one of the scenarios just real quick. One of the what ifs. It's one of my personal favorites. It's called Nuke 'Em Till They Glow.
Yes.
And there's a reason why we had to have that in there. When the Truman administration left and the Eisenhower administration came into the White House, they had a long and laborious discussions about what was going on and the spread of communism. And
Mm-hmm.
not just Korea, but China, all along the Pacific Rim, Taiwan,
Mm-hmm.
and they were really, really worried. Yeah, there was some probably worrisome in the Europe, but at that time, Brad, the United States nuclear arsenal consisted of 48 weapons or devices.
Oh, wow.
Of that 48, they moved 24 to Guam.
Oh.
Yeah. So
guess what they were going to do with them?
Oh, I
If
can
Chip-
guess.
if Chip Yong-ni would have went the other way, Chip Yong-ni is basically the Gettysburg of Korea,
Mhm.
if you want to put it in a time comparison. If we would have lost Chip Yong-ni,
Mm-hmm.
attack nukes would have been used.
Unbelievable.
So we had to do something and put something in there. So Nuke 'Em Till They Glow is in there. And it's a what if scenario that if it goes wrong, there is no winners, just a long winter.
Yeah.
So grab your partner.
Hey, and I was looking for something because I put it in here. I was delirious one night. I mean, like literally delirious one night. And I was hating everybody, well, almost everybody on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And I consumed way too much coffee and who knows what else,
Mm-hmm.
probably far too much medication. And I'd come across a piece of artillery,
Oh, Atomic Annie.
Atomic Annie. So I thought, well, I wonder if Paul Sawyer's going to catch this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I put the M65 atomic cannon on the Army list. And it's
Well, it was removed and put into a box out.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the box out, I know where the box out is. It's it's right here in the front.
But I started putting stats in for it.
Page 21. Page 21. M65 atomic cannon.
But I started putting stats in for it because they actually moved one of these to Guam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, that's
And then I even provided them the money shot picture where they fired this thing out in Nevada.
8 miles away.
Yeah. And but I put stats in for it, like, you know, the size of the crew and
Mm-hmm.
fixed weapon. It was a mobile, all that stuff, you know. And then I put down like special rules, and I put down like 50 D6 scenario ending, stuff like that. And of course, in my mind, you know, at 3 a.m., I'm chuckling to myself as I'm writing this. You know, I thought it was funny, but you know, our cousins in England, their sense of humor
didn't track. Yeah, no.
Yeah,
but we had to put that in there because that's, boys and girls, how close the Korea War got to being hot.
I was going to add lasers, but then I thought we're not going to add the lasers.
And then the other one about is Ivan Needs Your Help. Up until the fall in 1989, when the Russian government fell, there was always speculation, but no real proof that a majority of the MiG pilots were Russian.
Mm-hmm.
So up until 1989, that question was speculated. It was answered with a resounding, "Oh, hell yes." So in that scenario, Ivan Needs Your Help, they crashed communist jets in the middle of the board. And if the communist forces get to it first, great. They'll either grab Ivan or shoot him and get off the board. If the UN forces get him, it becomes a propaganda coup.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the Gary Powers 40 years early.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Right. Oh, that's cool. I love it. Yeah.
Go ahead, Brad.
I was just going to say, I'm loving all the flavor that's injected in here. And yeah.
And here's the cherry on the top.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the cherry on the top for the book. This was one thing that me and Steve fought from day one. We wanted it in the book. Paul Sawyer became on board, and he was fighting heavily for the book.
Mm-hmm.
For the first time in the history of bolt action, on the last page of the book, there's a dedication. If you're familiar with the 1950s Green Book series that the United States Army put out,
mm-hmm.
every one of those books, the very first page had the words, "To those who have served."
Mm-hmm.
We put that in the back of Korea.
Awesome.
So it's not just, it's a labor of love. Steve and I did Steve did a whole bunch of work on this stuff. And we wanted to make sure it was done right. So the last page, there's a dedication to not only those who served, but we just couldn't figure out how to get the Hangul into the typeset.
Mm-hmm.
So the second phrase in the back of the book is translated from Hangul, which is the Korean alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, "For those who lost their lives for this country." So there's actually a dedication to the combatants, which is the first time there's ever been done in bolt action.
Oh, that's awesome. Nicely done. Yeah, it's one of those things that when you say it, it goes, of course that should have been there all along. But of course, until it's done, you don't realize it's not there.
The second statement I had done in Hangul, the Korean language, and that was translated by a family friend. It was Brian's mom. She was actually from the Incheon area.
Oh, wow.
And but when we turned it over to the studio, and I guess when they turned it over to Osprey, they had difficulty getting that into typeset, which I thoroughly understand.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you don't, it's a very different alphabet. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And within the Asian translation, I will simply say that there's lots of nuances for
error.
And so for, I'll say political correctness, it was easier just to revert it back to English. And so sadly, we were not able to get that into Korean, but the intent was there.
Exactly.
And John and I, as veterans, and both of us have done deployments, in
Korea.
And it was important that, not just for bolt action Korea, but just as veterans and for veterans, we're playing a game, and we're enacting battles on a tabletop, but let us not forget the why.
Right.
We don't wave that flag, but almost every one of the people that's been part of John's Raider group throughout the years, all but one or two maybe, are veterans or have worked with veterans or somehow connected with veterans.
Yep. And the veterans who see that at the back really like it. I mean, it's one of those things. Like you said, it should have been there, but now it's there.
Exactly. Well, gentlemen, that I think is a beautiful segue to a beautiful end. I think thank you so much for coming on today. I was jazzed for this book before talking to you, albeit I've only just gotten my copy. It has gone wild. It's out in the wild now. So I am only scratching the surface. I haven't had time to sit down and, dig in because, as you say, it is 240 pages. There are tons of scenarios. We have 6 new army lists with variations within, with not just theater selectors, but time period selectors that match each army appropriately, and that allow you to play fun themed games, as well as if you want to play, competitively against another Korean player, you're able to do that.
Right.
Clearly, as you say, a lot of work has gone into this book. And
if anything, if it inspires somebody to pick up a book somewhere and read more, then we've done it.
Exactly. Well, I know just the announcement of you guys doing this led to me buying 3 books on history, one of which I mentioned earlier about the Korean War, and it got me listening to a lot of Korean War history podcasts. So I got to say.
And one more thing, Brad, you got the books, but if you get a chance, you got to watch that show, Tagukgi. It's Korean based. It's done by Koreans. There's a lot in the book that we tried to simulate from that movie. Yeah, there's some propaganda in it, but if you want to see just how nasty it got,
right,
that movie. And if you get the special selector 2-disc set, you get some more stuff on there.
Nice. Well, just to quickly also point out, guys, if you haven't checked out the Warlord Games website to check out the new range of models, I mean, clearly some of the Commonwealth, some of the Allied forces are using some repetitive models from World War II because they were using that equipment. But for Warlord to put out an entirely new Chinese army, for Warlord to put out an entirely new North Korean army, for Warlord to put out, we have brand new vehicles. We have the Patton, we have the BTR-40.
British and summer kit.
Yep, the Centurion.
And British infantry in summer kit. They're coming. There's about, I know of at least 6 months of release stuff that there's a ton, and then there's a whole nother aspect. So
that's awesome, man. And I mean, that is just as you say, that's just scratching the surface. We haven't even seen everything that's coming. That's just what's released day dot.
Yeah, and Big Alley's out there, and if you play Blood Red Skies, you love Blood Red Skies. Oh my goodness.
Yep.
Big Alley is just a whole nother, and he just put that out there to have some fun with it. And if that base swells, you'll see more jet ages up to missiles, because missiles are a whole nother a ball of wax. I don't know what's in there, but Big Alley. So now you can do that trifecta that everybody loves to do. You do a Korean action with bolt action Korea. Then you do another table with MiG Alley, trying to get bombers through. Those guys over on Lead Pursuit have some stats for B-29s now. Sweet. And then you do some Cruel Sea stuff, so you can have all 3 land, sea, and air games going on at the same time.
That's awesome. And yeah, as you say, the total package.
Yep, the total package.
Fantastic. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this, and thank you for all your hard work. It's fantastic that Bolt Action has sort of expanded beyond its borders. We're going in new and interesting directions, and hopefully this will continue. Depending on, I guess maybe how popular Korea is, and we see where we end up.
Yeah, and just for those people out there that are going to ask the question, when's Nam? I know it's out there, and
I'm not thinking yet. I'm just saying.
Well, and here's the caveat I'll say to this. My good friend Stephen Morris says this: why should we leap when we can walk? And what I mean is, there's always the Israeli wars. There's Indy-Paki. There's Rhodesia. There's all those brush fires. So instead of trying to guess what an M16 is like, let's walk it through those 15, 12 years between those two, and let's do it right. Exactly. So expect to see more, I think, because if this is as popular as we hope it is, this will open the door for now there's guys out there doing bolt action modern. Bless your heart, go knock yourself out. But if you want to see more of this, there you go.
That's fantastic. Oh, thanks, guys. Thank you so much for coming on. And thank you, listener at home, who've been sticking with us. This is a little bit longer than the Warlord Cast usually runs, but I don't think we've been Short of conversational topics today. So thank you for sticking with us. And thank you to everyone who have messaged with feedback for the show. We take the feedback that you guys send us, the questions, the requests. We take it very seriously here at the Warlord Podcast. If you would like to give us feedback, you can reach the host. That's me. My name is Brad. You can reach us through my other podcast social media page. If you go to Facebook and you search up Cast Dice, that's CASTDICE. That's my personal hobby page. If you message that page, that is where all the messages go, and that is where I compile things and pass them on either to Warlord, or I make sure that they are included in future shows. So again, thank you to everyone who has been supportive of this podcast. I guess we've been going for about 1.5 years now, and as I say on these podcasts regularly, but I don't want to take lightly, podcasts don't cost anything for you to pick up and listen to, but they do take time, and time is often money, or in some cases more precious than money for some of us. So the fact that you've taken the time to sit down and join us today to talk about, Warlord's exceptional games and products, just, we at Warlord Games and at the Warlord Game Podcast would like to say thank you for taking that time. It is appreciated. And I guess without further ado, I guess we'll have to see what's coming next, guys. I'm not going to tease the next episode. You're just going to have to wait this time. So until then, we would like to say, have a great time playing Warlord games. Good night.